Hello, travelers. Welcome to Reach the World's Explorer program. For over 20 years, Reach the World has inspired youth to become curious, confident, and compassionate global citizens through virtual exchange. My name is Tim, and I'm so glad you're joining us for today's live stream event. Today, we're continuing our exploration of the world of modern maps. I'm very pleased to welcome Phil Mielke, a 3D web experience product manager at Esri. So far in this virtual exchange, we've explored what modern maps are and what they can be used for. Phil is here to help us better understand the ways that modern map makers can make their maps really exciting to look at using a wide range of digital tools. I want to give a special welcome to the teachers and students who are joining us live today. Please feel free to use the YouTube chat bar to let us know you're here, where you're joining from, and of course to share any questions you have for Phil as we go. We'll get to as many questions as we can in the next 30 minutes. And with that, I'll keep it short and sweet. It's time to explore the world of modern mapping. Phil, welcome to Reach the World.
Hey, thanks very much, Tim. Well, as Tim mentioned, I'm Phil Mielke. I have been working with Esri for the last 8.5 years. And prior to joining Esri, actually, I kind of took a circuitous route to join a geographic information systems software company. At the start, I was in college and I was going through both a biology and a philosophy major, and was just really at a point where I was excited to soak up a lot of information, and really it was at the point where I was trying to decide what I really wanted to do with my life. And in a lot of those cases, you're not exactly sure, given the paths that are in front of you, how those things kind of connect up. But looking back on it, it all ends up making sense. So I studied the very first mapping that I learned was tracking deer movement patterns. I used a radio telemetry, basically a radio transmitter on 500 deer in Wisconsin, and we tracked what their regular movement behavior was in their locations to ultimately identify what's called a home range, where it is that they ended up spending time in order to understand and to analyze the slight migration patterns that that white-tailed deer have in Wisconsin, and how that may impact a lot of decisions on how to mitigate the danger. You guys might not be aware, but white-tailed deer are actually the most dangerous animal in the United States, just with car fatalities and everything else. So it's ultimately a mechanism where it was a chance to fund biologists, and from there, I learned the beginning parts of crime analysis in that wildlife ecology and crime analysis shared very similar practices. And so I came out from the Midwest. I took a leap of faith, so to say, coming out to California, and ended up taking a job working crime analysis with the Redlands Police Department. As a biologist, which is just, I think, a testament to be open to the directions that life can take you. I was a crime analyst, a GIS supervisor, and the CIO for the city of Redlands before joining Esri and the executive briefing team. Really got the chance to understand all of the depth of mapping and the processes that were underway to modernize mapping. Esri has been around for a while, and the interesting part about it is just how geographic information systems sort of evolve the process and the understanding of cartography, which is really interesting in my case, working on 3D. In a lot of cases, cartography is the abstraction of reality and a mechanism to make maps that are typically printed or drawn 2D information products. There's a lot of things that you need to be worried about in making 2D information products work. Projections, the understanding that scaling can differ over depending on how it is that you make that map in the area that you're covering. And 3D is a little different. It's actually an intent to try to actually either represent reality or start to work through a bit of a thematic understanding of mapping here. So what I wanted to do was to show you some examples, start to give you an impression as far as how 3D mapping works and how it's being utilized by a wide variety of customers, and also really give you a sense on how we're using that towards the future, and understanding that a lot of 3D mapping is actually pushed by the potential of reality capture, new mechanisms for gathering data, for representing data, and to provide a visual environment that you can literally define your customer's perspective. So I'm going to walk you through here first. What I'm showing on the screen is our product called Story Maps. And Story Maps is a way that you can combine media and maps and, of course, 3D maps, or as we call them, scenes. And in this case, we're going to talk through several scenarios and how some of our own improvements as far as the technology can be useful in some scenarios here. So the first one is the campfire. You may be aware that 2019 was a real. It's funny looking back on it. 2019 was a devastating year, and 2018 recorded the highest amount of burnt area that had been burned. And so this is an example or a map that's just representing the fire perimeters here. And so this is fueled by our product, Scene Viewer, and the ArcGIS API for JavaScript that ultimately allows and enables 3D mapping. And this is some very simple data that's draped on it. Now, the trick is to really be able to work with multiple scales and to start to understand some of the tools and ways that you can work through it, including filtering and selecting an individual fire that was a devastating fire, the campfire. So we worked with FEMA and the California Office of Emergency Response, CAL FIRE. A lot of organizations utilize GIS mapping to understand the total impact and to communicate with each other using maps. The great thing about mapping organization to organization, it's a language that is spoken, the way that organizations communicate to each other. We're aware of a problem here. These are our assets, our fire trucks, our fire people. Sometimes we're GPS tracking and making live connections to data. And in this case, what we're actually looking at is a smoke plume model that NASA had created using satellites to actually derive the overall coverage and height of a smoke plume at the specific time that this fire was occurring and that the satellites were passed overhead. You can really get a sense during this time San Francisco was greatly impacted by all of that smoke data. So in this case, we're actually not only discussing the disaster, but some features that are associated with mapping that can be helpful in this case. So these are building footprints. These are all the building footprints in the Paradise area. So for houses and for commercial buildings, restaurants, and things like that. And part of the understanding and the ability to be able to map in 3D is how to turn two-dimensional data into 3D data. Especially if you don't have a lot of existing 3D data, 3D models of all of the buildings. This is an example of 3D extrusion of those footprints. And one of the other things that we can do with this is actually stylize this. So this is colored using a symbology for mapping that helps us to understand the total amount of damage that each of one of these buildings incurred during the fire. It's the purposes of this are pretty wide ranging. It's used for the immediate response, of course, understanding the displacement of individuals, starting to understand the damage that had occurred there, and then moreover, start to fuel the recovery effort, understanding, if these houses were completely destroyed, well, that requires a lot of cleanup work, a lot of going back through the time period and understanding what had happened, and to combine this with other data to actually, in this case, we're filtering the data to understand those that were affected and and how affected they were, to maybe even learn something about it. Some of these buildings were completely fine. So what can we learn about how these buildings had survived or were just slightly affected compared to some of the major disaster? And I think that helps also to inform state policy decisions and build choices that builders make when they're building in a wildlife urban interface. And you can see here we've got imagery from that can help us to make sense of it. all of this collectively builds an understanding, that not only can we display this data in different ways, but here we're actually using the 3D amounts style to understand insurance loss. So it's the same data, we're just visualizing it a different way in order to learn something different and to understand some of the patterns that we have here. Now, collectively, this helps to give us an overall picture to combine data from a variety of different sources and to express that in a narrative that helps you to communicate, what's the problem, what's been learned, and then how can we plan to approach these kinds of problems again in the future. Mapping is wonderful for that kind of thing. And so, this is just one scenario I think that helps to walk you through that. Speaking of walking, while I worked in local government in the city of Redlands, one of the big things that we've been motivated by is a mechanism to understand safe routes to school. Everybody wants to make safe streets everywhere, sidewalks that are easily passable. How do we understand how to mitigate speeders and dangerous driving and create really very safe neighborhoods? But in a lot of cases, you actually need to prioritize where it is that you put these resources. So you'd be surprised to learn how much an intersection actually costs and how much time it takes to develop an intersection with lights and crosswalks and really establish safe practices in an area. So Safe Routes to School was a program that was intended to be able to prioritize, to focus on specific areas and to determine really how is it that we create the safest possible walking paths to school. And in this case, this is in Pasadena, California. So we start with data here that we're seeing. There's points that are showing the individual schools. They're labeled. These are the school boundaries. And then we start to approach it with more 3D data. So these are 5 and 10-minute walking distances to the schools. The inside's 5 minutes, 10 minutes walking distance on the outside. But there's some pretty amazing things that are happening in the detail here. All of these buildings have been mapped to a high level of detail. And this was actually mapped using laser beams, LiDAR data that has been flown, lasers from an airplane that is flying overhead, that is gathering individual points at a very high level of detail, just scanning the city. And all of those points have color values, they have height values that are associated with them, and all of those points kind of come together to help to give a representation of reality that can then be used to extract features, and in this case, all of these great buildings. And we've been in the 2D mapping game for a while, so we've got a great little base map that we can couple with this to combine to really show this scenario and make the most of it. And it's a great way to contextualize information to really help to show people where it is that they're looking at, where are the problems. And in this case, we have some symbology choices that are now associated with that path to school. These are all the streets that you would take, colored by the point that's here, in order to get to the school. And these are the main streets and the ones that really need to be paid attention to. So just like the other one with the campfire example, we really wanted to be able to combine this understanding of what does that picture look like, but not only that, combine it with data to also understand what does the actual safety look like. So there's a statewide database that records every collision, traffic collision that occurs car to person, car to bicycle. And it can, in this case, we can join those to the streets so that we're summing up, we're making a count of all of the traffic collisions that have occurred there. So we can really get a sense as far as how dangerous is this intersection? Where are the worst places? And what are the places that we actually need to worry about mitigating for danger? What can we do about this? And so by having a real picture of the problem, that gives you a little bit more of a plan of attack. And by visualizing this in 3D, we communicate this in other kinds of ways. So cycling through this story map, we're going to go to a new slide to see there's really this kind of virtual wall that's created here for students walking to this school. And this wall is, is a 3D representation. Look at those mountains in the background. That we can really understand where are the worst problems, and with that, what do we do to mitigate these issues? How do we make this problem better? So we identified traffic lights that can be used here and working with the city of Pasadena, ultimately working towards better understanding the placement of assets, resources, crossing guards to really improve how is it that that kids can have a safer path to school. So it's one less thing that they have to worry about as they focus on their futures. So a couple of other examples, just as far as those kinds of mapping styles. You can map train lines, you can map street safety in New York, the amount of traffic that occurs, and it's pretty incredible. So I guess a little underground, a little different, but this one's also kind of near and dear to my heart. And it also, I think, represents some of the value of 3D mapping. Oh, sorry, I just restarted here. This will come right back. But we were talking about a lot of scenarios that were occurring over the ground, both with streets and traffic collisions. But the great thing about 3D mapping and some of the focus that we have with being able to to see what others can't, and to focus on being able to approach visualizations that occur behind things or under things. That is really where some of the value of 3D starts to come into play. And we also have, other kinds of 3D analysis kinds of scenarios that I can show you as well. But in this case, this is a data set that I mentioned that's near and dear to my heart. Not everybody's super excited about this as I am, but storm drains. It's actually very important to understand, especially more so in the West maybe than the East. The kinds of flooding damages that you get in the East are with like rivers that extend and some flatter areas and really kind of cause major sweeping problems where FEMA has identified floodplains and issues that are associated with that. On the West Coast, rain doesn't happen very often, but when it does happen, it really comes hard. And I learned this, I grew up in the Midwest, and I remember such beautiful words for things like valleys and gullies and gulches and hollows. They're really sweet words about how water gradually erodes an area and takes things away. The West Coast, the Native Americans in the area had named a lot of the drainage areas that naturally occur arroyo for arrow. It's a dangerous, violent action that occurs when it rains. And part of that danger is ultimately what gets swept away, what potentially what kind of houses can be just swept right off of a cliff without the appropriate kind of drainage. So with that, the best way to understand it is ultimately by mapping that kind of infrastructure in 3D. To map utilities underground and know where things are, so that if you're digging in an area that you know that you might run the risk of a gas line or a power line that could be underground. And 3D GIS helps to enable that underground mapping so that you can get a better sense of what's occurring in all of these places. And this is a typical way that cities actually approach these kinds of problems. By having a good solid sense of what is all of that infrastructure that's buried and sometimes forgotten, that needs to be uncovered and remapped so that we can get a better sense as far as what is all of the data that we have underground, and how do we better plan for our city given the knowledge of how water flows in the area. That's a 3D problem, and as not immediately as exciting as it may be, this kind of, you might gain an appreciation for the underground. While we're at it, I might as well show you another example of the underground. The geology of Britain uses the British Geological Society uses our mapping in order to show all of the different kinds of lithography, the kinds of rock, soil, and other kinds of information that happen to be underground. These are called fence diagrams. And in each one of these, it's data that's gathered from you would, they're called boreholes. You'd basically drill deep into the ground and pull out that bore to understand what's the density of soil, what kind of rock is under there, where do you have, soil, sand, where does it transition to other kinds of rock? And it helps to ultimately identify really what's that geology there, because this is another kind of thing that you don't think about, but the complexity and variation of just the earth that you're sitting on top of right now is actually really intense and interesting. And it changes what you can build there. It changes the concept of, can you put a subway here? Who owns what all the way to the ground? All of these things are kind of complex 3D mapping issues. And in this case, I really appreciate what the British Geological Society has done in being able to map this out in a way that makes it a bit easier to understand. If you're in a certain place, what is under you. So one other thing that I think is also really interesting, because we talked about a little bit about 3D data and the approaches for understanding the visualization of 3D data. Well, one source is actually architects use software packages to design buildings. And they go into great levels of detail using, in this case, this is Autodesk. The product that they use is called Revit. And we have a relationship with them. Our company has a relationship with their company where all of the detail of architectural drawings can now be incorporated into 3D map. So, it's kind of the meeting of major minds and industries here, where on one end we were focusing on mapping cities and solving major city issues, crime analysis or state issues. We have a variety of scales that kind of focus a little bit bigger than typically where architects and engineers focus. And Autodesk is another organization that has been focusing on creating the best kind of drafting software that's possible for architects and for engineers to use. So when they come together, it is just amazing some of the things that you can do, because ultimately they're creating 3D data. And now we can incorporate that 3D data into a map. So we have all of these buildings that are happening behind the scenes, while we also have the major detail of this architectural drawing. Let's see, we'll find a good place and just really get into it. So this is a lot of detail. And all of this is being served over a browser. You could get this on your iPad or your iPhone and really understand this whole concept, which, it may already be something that you're hearing quite a bit, but the concept of a digital twin. It's this idea that, there's this world that exists virtually that contains a large volume of information. Every single one of these, this is a library. Every single one of these, this is something that can be incorporated to understand these bookcases and all of the books that could be filling these books. You use the digital twin like this in order to find what you're looking for, or facilities organizations, management organizations, the people who are in charge of this building will use it to understand, geez, what kind of doorknob do I need to order? And how many doorknobs do I need to order? Well, that's something that you would just be able to determine by looking at specifically in this area. And let's say we only wanted to see the doors. Well, that's something we can do. Maybe the plumbing too. It's kind of interesting. I always like the electrical infrastructure. Here's all the doors. All at once. And to really pull this information together helps to give you an idea as far as how you can approach some problems and modernize the way that we think of and we look at mapping. So, I wanted to share some of these examples. Tim, what do you think? We have enough time for one more example?
Yeah, let's do one more. These are fascinating.
I'm glad you think so. This is the Atlanta airport. Atlanta Airport uses us for some of the understanding of facilities and ultimately for routing to make sure that they're planning appropriately, that they're doing everything from checking there's lights in the runway that they need to check and to take care of. And in this case, there's really a lot of different things that are of value to this kind of digital twin. And so, the complexity of all of this geometry and imagery come together to really give you an idea. And what can happen now is in real time, understanding, not only the outside, but the inside of the built environment, where as all of this data starts to stream in, and again, this is all being served over the web to a browser, which, 10 years ago would have been completely bananas to happen. So we're able to have a great amount of complexity and visualization to help people to understand a little bit more of what if scenarios, planning, how many people can fit in an area, how would they find a path from point A to point B, where do we go in an evacuation, and then ultimately get a sense of the bigger picture, which can get pretty big. So it's been my pleasure to speak to you. I'm happy to answer some questions.
Oh, that's amazing, Phil. Thank you so much for those examples. We've talked to a couple of your colleagues over the last few weeks, and each time we hear from someone at Esri, at least to me, I think, wow, you can use a map to do that? Like the that of that question gets bigger and bigger, and this was no exception. There's now a whole new world of things that I think students can envision using a modern map to better understand or capture. Is fascinating.
Yeah.
I think that for a lot of students, especially those who like video games or into technology, they see a lot of elements of virtual reality or augmented reality in what you're doing. Is there a connection between those two worlds?
Oh, absolutely. So really, there are a couple of connections. One, we already have products for AR, XR, augmented reality, or the potential for virtual reality and all of its different kinds of forms. So we're directly serving applications that city planners use for this kind of thing. Moreover than that, we also have relationships with Unreal and gosh. I talk about it all the time, and now I forgot. With video game engines in order to get to port our data into Unreal and Unity video game engines, so that you can then use those video game engines as a basically a new mapping rendering engine, so that there's everybody kind of this is actually something I did when I was a kid, where you'd make video game levels of your school or of certain areas so that you could walk around. And I've seen it happen in a couple of different high school projects already, where they're making this port connection between GIS data that they're creating or gathering from somewhere and bringing it into game engines for other kinds of visualizations, or to skateboard around the world, or all kinds of different things.
That's pretty amazing. Seems like the future of maps.
Yeah, it's all coming together.
Yeah. You showed a couple examples of 3D maps being used to solve very real life problems or pragmatic problems. Do you ever create 3D maps just to create like a wow effect? There, you ever just like really want to make someone look at your map and say, wow?
So it's a little bit of both. It's a double-edged sword, I think, because originally, when 3D mapping started to happen, people would say, oh, that is eye candy. Why are you doing that? Like, it doesn't solve a practical problem. When actually it does. If you want to do noise analysis, if you want to understand what's behind another thing, or what people's viewpoints are, or there are a lot of how zoning changes, what kinds of heights. Those are the types of things that actually solve the problem very well. The thing that I think is most visually exciting recently is this research that we've been doing on voxels. So there's this idea that you have a picture. It has pixel, all of these little points. The same thing. Yeah, I mean, all of you have played Minecraft. Every single one of you, I'm sure. And you build a world that is representative of the locations that you can ultimately bring together, like building blocks. And you can do some really amazing things with the detail of those building blocks over time. And so, just like in visualizations about the subsurface, we are doing more and more to actually understand that kind of visualization. And it's very practical, but I think it's also very just beautiful as far as some of the examples that are created.
Yeah, the Minecraft connection is a great one. Will resonate, I think, with a lot of students.
Oh, sure.
Do you
It's so
then
yesterday, though. I mean, everybody's playing new stuff now.
It's evolving very quickly, it seems.
Mhm.
Do you consider yourself a cartographer, a mapper, an artist, or a combination of all of those?
Well, as much as I'd like to think of myself as somebody who gets to use this with the great level of detail and to create maps for all kinds of organizations, my role is actually, in some cases, sadly, but in other cases, also very excitingly, to help to understand what our users are creating so that we can make the software better so that they can do it. But I have spent 20 years making maps, and I really enjoy the variety of different ways to do it. And it straddles art and straddles science. And some of my favorite maps, I think, are like scientific visualizations.
Well, I was glad that you brought up the example of making maps with scientists who are using radio telemetry, because
Hmm.
any Reach the World student who follows the Explorer program has met a scientist who has used radio telemetry to track something in a forest or a jungle somewhere. And it's cool to see how, or learn more about how you can use that data to create a map and then use that map to make a decision that impacts wildlife conservation or safety within a community.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and the skills transfer very well. Most of the like I'm surprised at how frequently I meet somebody from Esri that you ask about what their background is, and they're like, "Well, I was trained as a biologist." I was like, of course, that makes sense." There's kind of a scientific intuitive process that is involved with working with a lot of data like this.
Sure, I have one more comment and then a closing question. I thought your example of the safe routes to school map was great, because any student who walks or bikes or even drives to school may be aware that there are crossing guards or stoplights or things controlling traffic along the way, but may not fully understand the planning and the thought that went behind those routes. So any student who's watching today, as you are packing up your backpack and getting ready to go home, uh, see if you can put on your sort of mapping mindset or your modern mapping frame of mind, and ask yourself, if you arrive at a stoplight or a crossing guard, why would Phil say we needed this here? Or why do you think the city decided to put the crossing guard here? And maybe you'll have some new perspective on that today. Finally, I wanted to ask you, for any student who hears what you're saying and sees your maps and what you do and thinks it's just the coolest thing in the world, what's your advice for young people who might want to follow a similar career path as you?
Sure. It's a great question. And I'd say it's one that's easier to answer these days than what was previously something that you kind of find yourself in over time. So geographic information systems is more and more of a practice that people are learning at all ages. Esri enables licensing that's free through K through 12. So all teachers and students can take advantage of licensing to then utilize desktop applications like ArcGIS Pro, which can be a little complicated to learn at first, but there are several learn lessons that are free in order to help to give you a sense as far as how you can pick this up starting from the beginning. And learn.arcgis.com is a great place to get started, where you can see just hundreds of lessons that are devoted to a variety of different subjects, all the way from beginner stuff to very advanced kinds of things. I actually wrote a lesson in there about visualizing social distancing data over time and understanding how people gradually came out of their houses more and more after the pandemic began. And it's an interesting way to see California sort of change over time, and all of that's a bit more advanced. It's a space-time cube visualization but all of the tools and then all of the steps that you would take are all available in those kinds of learn lessons.
All right, very good. Well, I hope all the students get out there and try those resources, make a map of your own. If there's something you've always thought, hey, I can do that better than the city or the school or my parents, make a map and prove your point.
It's the original language, ultimately. You know, everybody knows and has a spatial understanding.
All right. Well, Phil, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and expertise and all those great examples that you shared with us. I also want to thank our live stream audience, everyone who's watching the recording of this event after the fact. Glad you could join us. There's a lot more to explore within the world of modern mapping, virtual exchange. Actually, our last video call guest will be Charlie Fitzpatrick next week. So make sure you don't miss that. You can always go over to the chat bar in the YouTube page and check out the link to the Virtual Exchange homepage, which includes all of our past articles and recordings of our past video calls. So you won't miss a single thing. And for a complete listing of upcoming Reach the World events, you can visit athome.reachtheworld.org. And with that, we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks.